Hello, welcome to Secure the Continent with me, Gbenga Aborowa. This is the show where we bring you all the latest security situations on the continent of Africa. Before we delve into our main discussion for today's edition, which is looking at the threat of growing violent extremism in West African coastal states, let's first bring you the major security headlines across the continent. Spain and the United Kingdom have warned that Russia's influence in Africa threatens NATO security. DR Congo's military accused of killing civilians in Rwanda. And expect tough response, Nigeria's President Muhammadu Buhari tells perpetrators of wild killings in Nigeria's southeastern region. And at least 3 beheaded in attacks in northern Mozambique. Don't go anywhere, I'll be right back. Now, the threat of violent extremism across West Africa has been on the rise in recent times. Boko Haram and the Islamic State in West African province have been active in the Lake Chad Basin region. The implications for the peace and security of the sub-region has never been more pronounced. Togo, despite its proximity to countries affected by violent extremism, on May the 10th and 11th, jihadists attacked a Togolese military outpost and killed 8 Togolese soldiers. The incident was only a few kilometers away from the neighboring Burkina Faso, which struggles with incessant attacks from violent extremist organizations. We have more details for you in this package.
Many years ago, coastal West African states were some of the safest places on the continent. Several years down the line, the story has changed. Terrorism, both on land and on sea, is threatening the safety of millions of people across the region. A number of terrorist organizations have created bases for themselves in the sub-regions, and with the rise in poverty, inequality, corruption, and unemployment levels, these organizations and groups are able to lure in young West Africans. From Togo to Benin, Cote d'Ivoire to Mali, Burkina Faso, Ghana, Nigeria, violent extremism has become coastal West Africa's greatest security nightmare. The violence from militant groups have surged by 70% since 2021, as these countries witness some of the most devastating terrorist attacks in their history. Benin has faced more than 9 attacks since December 2021, while Togo has witnessed never-before-seen levels of violence. The challenge is that one country alone cannot solve this issue. There must be concerted, joint regional action and collaboration to end extremism and terrorism in the region.
Now, joining me to discuss this and more on today's Secure the Continent, I have the pleasure of having Dr. Christina Cotiero, Assistant Professor of Political Science at University of Utah. She joins in live from San Diego in the United States of America. I also have Dr. Festus Aubyn, the Head of Research and Capacity Building, West Africa Network for Peacebuilding, a regional office in Accra, Ghana. And I also have with me Leif Brotham, Associate Professor, Grinnell College, University of Wisconsin. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the program and thanks for your time.
Thanks for having us.
Now, I'd like to start with Dr. Cottiero. Togo, despite its proximity to countries affected by violent extremism, is one of West Africa's peaceful countries that has experienced peace and security until recently. On May the 10th and 11th, jihadists attacked a Togolese military outpost and killed 8 Togolese soldiers. What is responsible for these attacks, and has any group claimed responsibility?
Thank you for having me on. And actually, right before this program, there was just today near the border of Togo and Benin and Burkina Faso, another attack that killed 50 people. So part of the reason why this is happening is that these areas in the north of Togo and Benin are not densely populated and are heavily forested and difficult to sort of monitor the movement of groups in these areas. And as you mentioned before, the response coordination between countries has been difficult. So in addition to bilateral cooperation agreements that these countries have with each other around border policing, there are also a number of overlapping initiatives and a number of overlapping regional organizations. And so there's difficulty sort of centralizing coordination to manage these border regions. And recently that's only gotten worse with instability in the region.
Thank you, Dr. Cottiero. I'd like to bring in Dr. Aubyn here. Dr. Cottiero rightly said, that the stress has always been there, and we've seen a breakdown of security in the northern and Sahelian states. The question is, why is this happening now? And what are the violent extremist groups that operate in the Sahel? And are they all aligned, or do they have different tactical preferences and operate in specific context?
Thank you very much, and greetings to your viewers. I think, like you rightly pointed out, I mean, the threat has always been there. I mean, since the ACCRA initiative was formed by the coastal countries within the region. And if you recall, most of the groups affiliated to Al-Qaeda and ISIS operating in the central Sahelian countries, Mali, Burkina, Niger, have on countless occasions declared their intention of expanding towards the coastal areas in West Africa. And so it is not surprising that we are experiencing the kind of attacks that are happening in Benin, Togo, and of course, Côte d'Ivoire. If you look at how the situation has evolved over time, you will see that most of these groups are basically exploiting local vulnerabilities and also the porous borders that was mentioned earlier on to expand their activities and also to expand their geographical reach within the region. And so the threat has always been there, like you rightly pointed out. And I think that most coastal countries have more or less downplayed the threat until what is happening within the region, which is more or less causing for more robust strategies to deal with these increasing threats.
Thank you, Dr. Aubyn. I'd like to bring in Liv. Now, Liv, would we say, we right to say that the jihadist threat in the Sahel has finally arrived in the coastal states of West Africa following recent attacks, the W Park in Republic of Benin earlier this year, and what Dr. Cottiero mentioned earlier, just today in northern Togo, another attack has been reported. Would you say it's a failure of intelligence services in this West African coastal state not to be able to have predicted and prevented these attacks from happening? Because the handwriting has always been on the wall.
Thank you. Well, I think clearly intelligence services should be able to recognize at this point that semi-regular attacks are highly likely. Whether they can predict specific attacks, when they will happen and where they will happen, probably depends on their, the informant networks that they have and whether they can, receive reliable and accurate information from them in order to deter these attacks. I will say that the protected areas, including Park W and Franjari, which span across three countries, Burkina Faso, Niger, and Benin, form an excellent place for these groups to hide and to organize and to evade surveillance, whether it be from security forces or even everyday people, because there aren't settlements, there aren't villages in these areas. So they really form excellent places for them to operate, which I think makes intelligence gathering and the kind of prediction that you refer to very difficult.
Thank you, Dr. Cottiero. One thing we always hear when it comes to counterterrorism and extremists is there are always underlying socioeconomic conditions that predicate these attacks. Now, looking at Togo and Benin and Ivory Coast, does this make them a prime target for extremist activities? Have you identified, are there local grievances in these countries that these extremists are looking to exploit? Because it's the same story in northern Sinai, in Egypt and Cabo Delgado in Mozambique. Is it the same thing in these coastal states?
Absolutely. So the people who do live in the north of Benin and Togo, these are the regions in those countries which have the least development in terms of infrastructure, the least reliable public services, access to everything from education and water, and even just security and feeling protected. And one issue that's arisen as well in other states in the region is that, we find that some people are worried just as much about protection from the security forces as they are from the terrorist groups themselves. So these are all things where I know these governments have, Benin and Togo have been proactively trying to do more to, be more involved in these border regions to identify, the needs of people and what sort of interactions they're having with groups that cross the border. But it is difficult when there's been a historical neglect of development in the north of these countries in favor of concentrating investment in towards the coast where the capital cities are. And I think in general, that's part of the reason why some of these groups have gained purchase in various countries. When you look at, Boko Haram, where they started out, when these groups are starting out, they're in more remote areas, not nearby the capital. These states, I think, were, to some degree initially somewhat complacent because the threat was not near the centers of power. And, in the coming week, there's going to be an emergency, African Union summit that's going to be talking about what they can do better in order to assess these threats more accurately and respond more appropriately.
Thank you, Dr. Cottiero. Now, Dr. Aubyn, we've seen some level of intervention from G5 Sahel, the French and multinational joint task force. They haven't been able to nip this extremism in the bud, even despite all these years. My question to you is this: how has this violent extremist groups been able to survive and fund their operations against the might of sometimes Western powers that have tried to help to change this situation? How do they fund themselves?
Okay, I think there are a couple of factors. One, if you look at the operations that you mentioned, they have been overly focused on the military approaches, which does not address the root causes of the problem, the social, the economic, and the political issues that are fueling the problem. And that is why you see that despite the existence of these national and regional and multilateral security operations, still the problem still continues to persist because we are not addressing the root causes of the problem, which lies in the issues of governance, the issues of inequality, the issues of injustice. And so far as the root causes are there, the jihadist groups or the extremist groups will continue to exploit them to gain local support to continue to perpetuate their activities. The other issue has to do with issues of transnational organized crimes, which also fuel the violent extremist and terrorist activities in these regions. If you look at the trend over time, you will see that one of the things that has sustained these groups is their involvement in various forms of transnational organized crimes like drug trafficking, human trafficking, trafficking of motorbikes, trafficking of smuggled goods and all that, which gives them kidnapping for ransom, which gives them the finances to sustain their operations in these regions. And then lastly, if you also look at some of the conversations around extremism in the Sahel, I mean, there have also been discussions around some invisible hands also providing support to these groups, because if you look at how they've been able to sustain their operations despite the offensive against them and the kind of ammunition they even use against state forces in the region, people have also alleged that they are actually invisible hands that are also providing support to these groups. So I think that is a combination of factors that has led to these groups taking roots within the region. But
some of the things, sorry to interrupt, some of the things you mentioned, that these things only happen in failed states or countries where you have vast ungoverned spaces. And Ghana has been relatively stable, Togo too. So why are we seeing these sort of things fester in these countries and Benin?
Yes, I mean, you see, you use the word relatively stable. It doesn't mean that they are absolutely, stable.
Or there are no fault lines.
Despite those descriptions, there are internal problems. If you look at all these three countries, there are serious internal issues that are more or less related to what we have in the Sahel. Just that those in the Sahel are more serious than those that we find in the South. In Ghana that you mentioned, today we are increasing our presence in our border areas. We are increasing public awareness of the threat because there are local vulnerabilities that these groups can exploit. The issue about unemployment, the issues about poverty, the issues about porous borders, all of them, if you look at across these coastal countries, they all have these vulnerabilities. So those descriptions can be there, but when you come in terms of reality on ground, you will find most of the issues that we see in the Sahel playing out within the coastal regions of West Africa. The only difference may be the intensity in terms of the local vulnerabilities in the coastal areas as compared to the Sahel areas.
Thank you, Dr. Aubyn. Now, Leif, you've done extensive research on the farmer-herder situation in some of these coastal states. The United Nations estimates that 80% of the agricultural areas in the Sahel belt are already affected by climate change. How much of a contributory factor is this to the conflict? And what are the dynamics between herder and farmer conflicts in some of these coastal states? And how do they affect the general scenario?
Yes, climate change is certainly a factor, but it is inseparable from land and resource degradation, which has made resource competition between farmers and herders much more fierce and much more likely to lead to violence. And what we see happening is a lot more frequent crop damage occurring when livestock trample or eat crops in standing fields. And that happens because more and more fields are in more isolated areas where livestock herders have traditionally grazed. And you also see livestock herders moving further south and moving into areas where they may not have historically passed. And to make this a more difficult issue to address, you see traditional institutions that mediate farmer-herder disputes unable to address many of these problems, and just overwhelmed with either the sheer number of incidents that they have to handle, or the severity, or the fact that certain groups will encounter the others in a threatening way with weapons. And so you see rising levels of violence in northern Benin, but also in Ghana, as you pointed out, but not just in northern areas, also in more coastal areas further south. So you see a movement of livestock herders down into the furthest, most southern parts of the coastal countries, which produces a new set of challenges because there people who live down there are less familiar with herders. They do not have the social relations to accommodate their arrival, and you see a greater risk of conflict in all of these countries.
Thank you, Liv. Now, Dr. Cottiero, we've seen the situation in this coastal states quite complex. So you have border and transnational criminal networks operating on one hand. You also have the herder-farmer dynamics and also terrorists. Now, let's talk about the response and how the international community is trying to stop this trend of terrorism. Now, over the last decade, there has been many counterterrorism interventions. Dr. Aubyn did touch on this a little earlier on, such programs like the French-led Takuba, Task Force Takuba, the multinational Joint Task Force, and the United Nations Multidimensional Stabilization Mission in Mali. Looking at the time, I mean, a lot of these interventions have spanned over 10 years, and they've assumed different names over the years. And billions of dollars have been pumped into this, into some of these ventures. So why have they failed to stem the growth of these violent extremist groups? They seem to be expanding.
Right. Well, just quickly addressing one thing with your earlier question to Dr. Aubyn, I think another issue you have to look at with the states that are further north above, Benin, Togo, closer to Libya, in terms of why they have, additional part of the additional issue there is access to arms that are, once the Libyan government sort of fell into disarray, it became much easier for gun smuggling to go from north to south. And so that's part of the issue, is that those states are kind of closer to the front line in that, Libyan disarray. But with respect to the cooperative initiatives, one really big issue right now, I would say, is that, the G5 Sahel, for example, last week, the president of Niger said that it's dead. Part of the reason for this is because you have governments in West Africa that are now controlled by militaries who assumed power through coup d'etat. And the other West African states and ECOWAS are trying to isolate those governments, put sanctions on those governments in order to try to, enact political change and have them hold elections. But the consequence of that attempt at isolation has been that now you have countries that were previously engaging in more military cooperation, relatively speaking, like Mali, that are no longer, willing to do so. So that is certainly exacerbating things. You have multiple governments in the region that are controlled by, militaries, and their co-members don't really want to give them sort of recognition as equals. So you have that on the one hand. You also have the issue, like you said, that there are these overlapping agreements, and frequently, there's frustration if it's unclear whether soldiers that are working in these border regions are pursuing armed groups that cross one border or another. Frequently, it's not well received if those soldiers then proceed to chase those groups when they cross over neighboring states' borders. Yeah. So borders themselves are partially an impediment to the effectiveness of that cooperation. And organizations that have greater sort of human capacity in terms of larger staff and know-how, like ECOWAS, have complained for years that they have been sidelined in favor of some of these other more ad hoc security arrangements that we've discussed. But ECOWAS is an organization that does have more experience coordinating among regional police. So it's possible we'll see more movement towards that. In recent months, Togo and Benin have both sort of just completed new information sharing, intelligence sharing centers that are supposed to be connected to co-member states. So we'll see whether or not that improves the situation. With respect to the herders that are moving south, many of them are, especially in Nigeria, not particularly ideological. So they're not necessarily, when groups have tried to recruit them to this, Al-Qaeda's ideology, a lot of these groups are not particularly interested. They just keep going about, again, doing what they've already been doing. So that, to some degree, there is a risk there with some of those groups getting radicalized, but it's not fully something that's actually happened in most places.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Cottiero. We'll go on a quick break. I would like to say a very big thank you to you, Dr. Christina Cotiero, for being a part of the program. And when we come back in the second half, Dr. Dan Gbenga will be joining us as a research fellow at the African Center for Strategic Studies at the University of Florida, USA. Thank you very much, Dr. Cotiero. So we'll go on a quick break, and when we come back, we've been discussing the growing extremism threat in the West African coastal states. We'll continue our discussion after this break. Do stay with us. Thank you for staying with us here on News Central Television. If you're just joining in, this is Secure the Continent. And we've been discussing the growing threat of extremism in West African coastal states. And joining me in the second half of the show is Dr. Dan Gbenga, who's a research fellow at the Africa Center of Strategic Studies from the University of Florida in the United States of America. Thank you very much for joining Dr. Gbenga.
My pleasure. Glad to be here, Vega.
And we also have the presence of Dr. Festus Aubyn, Head of Research and Capacity Building at the West African Network for Peacebuilding Regional Office in Accra, Ghana. We also have Leif Brottom, Associate Professor at Grinnell College, University of Wisconsin. I would like to start the second half with you, Dr. Gbenga. We've seen the withdrawal of French troops from Mali and the Malian junta's decision to withdraw from the G5 Sahel force. And we've also seen growing anti-French sentiments across the West African sub-region. Does this have any impact on peace and security of the region, or is it negligible? Because when you look at it holistically, you look at the context of things. 10 years since Takuba and Burkina and Mali, it doesn't seem like the security situation has improved. What's your take on this?
Well, I think it's a great question, and it's a really important strategic concern for Malians in particular. So I believe that Operation Barkhane and all French forces in Mali are set to be withdrawn from Mali by the end of August. And we've already seen the security situation in northern Mali begin to deteriorate. And so it's hard not to draw a direct correlation between the two. In fact, I think that in the first quarter of 2022, there were more deaths, more civilian deaths at the hands of militant Islamist groups in Gao region and Menaka region in northern Mali than there have been in any previous calendar year beforehand. And I think that part of what we need to recognize here is that while there is growing discontent at the security situation, that's very understandable, that the Operation Barkhane and French forces were providing some elements of security that the Malian armed forces have not been able to provide. And the junta in power has failed to step their game up to do that. And it's an ongoing concern that we've seen in the Sahel, that over the last 5 years, regional armies haven't been able to sustain a security presence in a way that protects communities and provides security for citizens. And I don't think we've seen that change with the junta coming to power. Originally, they took power in August 2020. And if you look at violence across the region from militant Islamist groups, every quarter since August 2020, it's been higher than any quarter before. And so the data are fairly plain.
Sorry to jump in there. Is it too early to judge the presence of Wagner in terms of its implication in the security and stability in the region? Because they've been there for less than a year, and maybe that's why the Malian government decided to try something different. What would you say about the presence of the Russian mercenary group, the Wagner group, vis-a-vis the security situation in Mali?
So I would say that estimates are there are about 1,000 Wagner mercenaries in Mali right now. And 1,000 Wagner mercenaries is not going to be sufficient to sustain security in northern Mali. We've also seen that they've been implicated in numerous human rights abuses in which Malian soldiers with Wagner mercenaries are accused of killing civilians. These kinds of abuses on communities are the types of things that cause people to join militant Islamist groups. They push people into a radicalization that then furthers insurgency. And so I think that it is not too soon to say that the Wagner mercenaries that are in Mali are really fueling conflict and increased security, not the reverse. And in fact, I think it's important to note that the real presence of Wagner mercenaries in Mali is actually indicative of the junta's own weaknesses. The junta needs regime security. It needs to try and maintain its position of power. It was only a few weeks ago where they put out that there was an attempted coup from within the Malian armed forces. So I think it's important to remember that there are divisions within Mali, the Malian armed forces itself. And I think that that's really what the Wagner mercenaries are there for. They're there to help the junta remain in power, to entrench their control over the political system. They're not there to provide stability. And 1,000 Wagner mercenaries was never going to be able to accomplish that in the Sahel.
Thank you very much, Dr. Eisinger. Now, Leif, during the course of the program, we did talk about the failure of intelligence to have been able to see that these attacks were going to move southwards towards the West African coast. Now, it's been 10 years post multinational joint task force, and since West African states have decided to do something about it, but they haven't been able to nip this in the bud. What are the consequences of not managing and addressing this conflicts in the Sahel for this West African coastal states? What's at stake here?
Makes it much more difficult to learn the lessons of the last 10 years in the Sahel and in Mali in particular, particularly with regarding the issues that Dr. Eisinger just described. What you see are very similar conditions, underlying conditions and underlying risks in coastal states such as Benin, including rural poverty, and especially in northern areas, and also social discrimination against certain groups, especially young pastoralists. And what you are already starting to see in Benin is that the increased attacks since December 2021, you have increasing security actions and surveillance actions that are targeting those groups in ways that are unfair and justified in terms of counterterrorism. But what they do is they create animosity, and they actually increase the likelihood that these groups will be able to recruit locally. As of now, it could be that it is outside groups that are operating from remote areas or crossing the borders to carry out operations. But what we have learned from the Sahel, which are lessons that may have been lost as the threat emerges in coastal West Africa, are that heavy-handed counterinsurgency and military options can be very counterproductive, cause suffering in civilian populations, and actually make the problem worse by increasing recruitment to armed insurgent groups.
Thank you, Leif. Now, Dr. Aubyn, some aid group, talking about the response of nations to dealing with this insurgency, some aid groups have said and believe that a largely militarized response to violent extremism could actually provoke retaliatory attacks and, like Leif just said, give a reason for more recruitment drive. In your opinion, what should be the best response to dealing with this?
Well, I think that whilst we are concerned about militarized approach in dealing with the problem, I think we also need the military to provide the enabling environment for other processes to follow. And so, in my view, we need a balanced approach, mixing military and non-military approaches. The concern has always been that the focus has been on the military approach, neglecting the non-military approaches, which tackles the root causes of the problem.
Can you just let me jump in there for a second? So when you talk about military and non-military approaches, some of these violent extremist groups are not people that you can readily negotiate with or reason with. What's in it for them to drop their arms? And it's not like all of them are, like Dr. Cottiero said earlier, not all of them share the same ideology or they're fighting for some sort of freedom or higher ideals. So when you drop the military approach and you mix it with non-military responses, what's the chance that they might buy into that? Or how do you go about it?
Well, I think you need to understand why people join these extremist groups. I mean, people don't join, from the work that we have done in the region, people don't join groups because of ideologies. People join for safety and security reasons. People join to retaliate for the indiscriminate killings or human rights abuses of the security agencies. People join because of injustice. People join for all kinds of reasons, which are the key issues that, in my view, we need to address. It's not about negotiating with those groups to lay down their weapons, but it's about dealing with the local vulnerabilities that they exploit to continue to recruit people to join them in pursuing their interests in the region. I will give you an example. There are people like the headers, the herdsmen, the Fulani herdsmen who have been implicated in Burkina Faso and in Mali. Most of them join these groups to protect their cattle because of cattle rustling.
Yes.
So in dealing with this threat, how do you provide security for those group of people? How do you deal with issues of marginalization? Because for the Fulanis, wherever they find themselves, they are the minority group, they feel discriminated. How do you improve governance? How do you deal with issues of inequalities, marginalization, for people to feel the utility of the state in their lives? You see, so these are the issues we are talking about, the peripheral areas where they normally operate around the border regions. Most of these areas have been neglected by the state for so long. And that's why you see that even in the coastal states, we are having most of these challenges along the border areas because most of those areas lack effective state presence. You see, so using a military approach at best will reduce the problem to the minimum, but it will not address the root causes of the problem. And that is why we are advocating for also focusing on the non-military approaches, which has to do with improving issues of governance, dealing with issues of corruption, dealing with issues of poverty, unemployment, providing safety and security for the people in these areas, and also improving access to justice. Because most people are joining this group because of injustice, because of the killing of their relatives or friends. So we need to move beyond the militarized approach and look at the local vulnerability, the local concerns of communities and that is exploited by these violent extremists and terrorists.
Thank you, Dr. Aubyn. Now, Dr. Eisinger, talking about African solutions to African problems, the response of African nation states to this growing threat of extremism in the West African sub-region. The ACCRA initiative was launched in 2017 by the Republic of Benin, Burkina Faso, the Ivory Coast, Ghana, and Togo in response to dealing with this violent extremist threat and transnational organized crime. How successful has this initiative been?
Well, I think that in this case, it is too soon to tell. I think the ACCRA initiative has done a laudable job in terms of bringing together governments to face threats that are in their nature regional. And so you need to have a regional response to those types of threats.
Is there a lot of cooperation between these countries?
There is, or at least there's more than there would have been otherwise. In fact, I think that the number of joint operations between Burkina Faso and Cote d'Ivoire in particular has gone up significantly in the last 2 years. And it's safe to say that there's been some positive effects to that. There have been attacks in northern Cote d'Ivoire and in southwestern Burkina Faso where those operations have occurred. But at the same time, I think the key here is for those governments to continue to coordinate their efforts and deconflict their movements. And so that if through that coordination, they can shore up some of their security presence, then they can begin to do some of the other types of government services, other types of initiatives that can stem the flow of recruits or the appeal of these militant Islamist groups to those communities. And I think that's exactly what all of us are kind of getting at with military and non-military approaches. You really need to have a global approach to what could become a more entrenched insurgency. And what that means is being able to provide government services for the needs of the communities there. And that includes security, but it also includes things like veterinary services. It includes like services such as access to food, to water. It includes services such as justice. And so in context where you have an insurgency, the military needs to be ready with civilian staff and with its other law enforcement partners across borders to respond to those types of issues, to be able to identify them and then be able to address them. And when doing so, then they can begin to develop a counterinsurgency strategy that helps to put pressure on these groups. And so for those fighters that are strongly motivated by ideology, who at the end of the day will be very difficult to negotiate with, that sustained pressure and the support from the communities for the government forces will just degrade that organization until it's no longer able to operate. That's the key to success here. And I think that there's a lot for coastal countries to learn from what went wrong in Burkina Faso, Mali, parts of Niger, to identify what not to do. And part of that is to not have such a strongly militarized approach on communities and instead identify the government services that are lacking in those contexts, be able to sustain the provision and to maintain a security presence that protects their communities. If they can do that, then they may be able to avoid insurgencies gaining ground and developing roots within communities that do not otherwise have them.
Thank you, Dr. Eisinger. And finally, before we wrap things up, Liv, let's talk about Burkina Faso, which is fast becoming the ground zero of this growing threat to extremism. The military government there kicked out the democratically elected president, Christina Cotiero, citing security failure as a reason. And we've seen the data that things are really worse there. But at the same time, the ECOWAS has isolated the African Union. They've isolated Burkina Faso. We know how important Burkina Faso is, and dealing with the threat there, because it's beyond a certain nation. So what is your solution? How do you approach Burkina Faso? How do we get out of this conundrum? Because, and also the French are not dealing with the military governments in Mali. So and we need a global approach, like Dr. Eisinger said. So how do you deal with this military government on one hand, and how do you have some sort of cooperation with them in dealing with the growing threat of insurgency if you've sanctioned them and you've isolated them? Can you kindly unmute your mic? Thank you.
I wish I knew exactly what the solution was, but I think you've really identified a crux issue. Burkina Faso is a crossroads, and that has become very clear over the last several years in the way that the insecurity has spread in the sub-region. And so any regional durable solution must include effective action in Burkina Faso. I think that one very important element will certainly be to prevent Burkina Faso from backsliding even further, as Mali has. And one specific aspect of that is certainly the presence of the Wagner Group mercenaries in Mali, who very quickly began to contribute to a deteriorating human security situation in Mali. So preventing such backsliding in Burkina Faso will be critical. Finding creative ways to improve human security and to improve human security in rural areas and prevent armed groups from gaining sympathy in rural communities where they can then recruit. So addressing the justice issues that Dr. Aubyn mentioned earlier. And so there's many actors involved, many partners, that different international organizations that are present in Burkina Faso can think about creative ways to carry out these things without providing unnecessarily legitimacy to the military government.
I would like to say a very big thank you to you all members of the panel for being a part of today's program. I would like to thank Dr. Christina Cotiero, Assistant Professor of Political Science at the University of Utah, Dr. Festus Aubyn, Head of Research and Capacity Building, West African Network for Peacebuilding in Accra, and Leif Brougham, Associate Professor at Grinnell College, University of Wisconsin, and lastly, Dr. Dan Eisinger, Research Fellow at the Africa Center for Strategic Studies, University of Florida in the United States. Do appreciate your insights and candor and your time. Thank you for being a part of the program.
Thank you very much.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now, West African states must act quickly and decisively to avert instability across the sub-region from violent extremism. Given the constraints highlighted by our distinguished panelists on today's program, they must prioritize efforts aimed at addressing the underlying socio-economic triggers of violent extremism, like problems related to injustice, social cohesion, and peaceful coexistence, in addition to fundamentally improving relations between the state and society. But violent incidents on the rise and concern in northern coastal states affected countries are taking serious security measures to counter the spread of this extremism. Until next time on Secure the Continent, I'm Gbenga Aborowa. Join us next week for another edition. Bye-bye.